Hello everyone, Sientir here with another Rambler, and today I want to talk about some game design stuff. Specifically, I want to talk about something that I call the generically good problem that happens with a class of items that show up in games that I call Augment Items. Now, these show up in a number of games, and what they specifically do is they kind of modify something. I'm going to focus on examples from two game franchises, specifically hold items from Pokemon and rings from the Dark Souls games. This concept shows up in other games. For example, in Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, you had the runes that you could insert into your weapons, and in Shadow of War you have the gems. Gemstones are actually a very common use for this sort of concept. Guild Wars 1 has these show up as insignia for your armor, runes for your armor also, and like mods for your weapons. They show up in Guild Wars 2 as like sigils and runes there. It's a pretty common idea. So what I mean here by generically good is that the effect that they provide is kind of just generally useful. And I'll give some specific examples in a moment, but first I want to give kind of context for how I'm going to be looking at these items in the specific games. So if you're not familiar with Pokemon, it's an RPG where you collect Pokemon and you can battle them, and it works somewhat differently from other types of RPGs in so much as you have a team of up to 6, but only one of those is out and active in battle at any given time, and you can switch them around. And they have 4 moves each, and they can have a hold item. And the hold item provides some sort of benefit. For example, Leftovers is a hold item that restores a 16th of your max HP at the end of each turn. That one is very popular. Something like a Lumberry, it can be one-time used to cure a status condition when you receive it. Things like that. And specifically for Pokemon, I'm going to be talking about in a competitive context or a PvP context. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that the dynamics of what hold items are good in PvP or player versus player and PvE or player versus environment are different. The other thing is that they matter a lot more in PvP than they do in PvE. And this is because most competitive Pokemon is done with every Pokemon is put at the same level. So there's 100 levels in the game, and levels can have a really big impact. So in PvE, you tend to often operate at a level advantage. So that's going to have a significant contributing factor. And the other thing is that there's a number of hold items which are like single use, which become a lot less desirable in PvE, but in PvP, because they get restored at the end of a competitive match, it doesn't matter. The other thing that you run into in PvP that's different is that because you usually play at a match-by-match basis and you're fully healed in between, certain things become a lot more viable. A really good example of this is a hold item called Life Orb, which increases your attack damage by 30%, but whenever you perform an attack, I think it has to successfully hit, you lose 10% of your max HP. So that item is not very good in PvE, generally speaking, because you're hurting yourself, basically, and it will run through your HP very quickly. So it really damages your sustainability, but that's not a problem in PvP usually, because it's one battle as opposed to a bunch of battles over the course of a long period of time. So just like what items are good is different. And like I said, they matter a lot more in PvP because you don't have a level advantage, and you also have somebody who has, let's just say, human players are usually a lot smarter than the AI, and they usually don't make a team of like 1 or 2 Pokemon for your team of 6 to battle against, and they usually have movesets that actually do things, and they usually use more than one type. So they're an entirely different ballgame than what PvE is. Now, with Dark Souls, I'm not necessarily looking for a specific context. There are definitely contexts where certain things become better. For example, in Dark Souls 2, Jester's armor, for those unfamiliar with the Souls games, you may have heard about them most likely. They're known for their difficulty, but the gameplay is a third-person action RPG. So you kind of run around, and there's a little bit of a hack and slash element to it, where you have your attack buttons, but it's a slower pace of combat. You need to be kind of tactical. You need to make sure you're not getting surrounded. You have a stamina that limits how often you can attack, how long you can block attacks for, and how often you can dodge attacks, how long you can run. So most of your actions, aside from like walking, consume stamina. You can hold up your shield, but so stamina management is a key part of that game. Now, there are the idea of critical hits, which one of the best known ones is the backstab attack, which is where if you get behind an enemy, you can perform a critical hit that does a lot of damage. Now, there's a piece of armor called Jester's Armor in Dark Souls 2, which makes you immune to backstabs. That's okay in PvE, but in PvP, it becomes way stronger for a variety of reasons. Now, just speaking of that brings up sort of a related class of items that I'm not looking to talk about here, but they can suffer from a similar problem. And that's like items with unusual special effects. So Jester's Armor is an example of this. The Grasscrest Shield, which improves stamina regeneration, that shows up in Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3. That's a very useful item, particularly in Dark Souls 1. The Shield of Want in Dark Souls 3 is also very useful. It basically increases how much, like, you have a currency that you can buy levels or items with, and it increases how much of that you get. But these sort of items are not quite what I'm talking about, and you can find them in other games as well. Middle-earth, Shadow of War, you can get weapons in that they usually will have some sort of modifier on them. That's not the same thing because you can't take that modifier out, so it's kind of tied to the stats. A good example of how that matters is in Dark Souls 2, there are a couple of stamina regeneration shields, but they're not usually considered nearly as good as Grasscrest Shield because they're usually kind of heavy and their blocking stats are just really bad. They don't block damage very well. So you can use them, but the strength is much lower. So that has a kind of a big impact on things. Part of what makes, like I mentioned, the Shield of Want that increases how much currency you earn from defeating enemies so good is it also has solid stats. So you're not like losing out on stats by using it. So specifically then going back to Augment Items, the original problem that I brought up was this idea of generically good. So some examples of this are the Rings of Favor and Protection, or the Dragon Rings in Dark Souls 2, but it's the same idea. It boosts a bunch of stats. These rings are just really strong and they do a lot of things for you. They boost a lot of stats. They're just generically good. Basically, any sort of character you're making benefits because they like give you more stamina. They allow you to carry more gear without losing your roll speed. How effectively you can dodge is based upon how much stuff you're carrying, right? So if you are able to carry more stuff without having your dodge compromised, that's good. And they also like increase how much stamina you have, which is also really good. So these are like all really strong things, and they make these really powerful rings. Now, there are a couple differences. Dark Souls 1, you only have 2 ring slots, which means that the effect to some extent is more pronounced. So when you're playing Dark Souls 1, because you can only choose between 2 rings, that choice is a lot more impactful. And in other words, generically powerful rings consume a lot of your ring slot potential. Dark Souls 2 and 3 both have 4 ring slots, so the problem is somewhat diluted, but you still run into this issue. You have things like Havel's Ring, which dramatically increases that how much stuff you can carry before your roll gets compromised benefit. They really increase it quite a bit typically. Not as much as in Dark Souls 1, it's the strongest era, but this ring is generically good, right? It lets you put on more equipment, like better armor and stuff like that, while still being able to roll really well. And so it's going to take a lot to be able to like overcome that. The Chloranthy ring is also one that's really, really just generically good. It improves your stamina regeneration rate. That's really strong. So these are some examples of some generically good rings. There's also another sort of problem which shows up in these games, which is if you're going for this type of build, then you basically have to use this ring to make it work, sort of thing. And this is kind of an interesting balance problem. So what I mean by this is the Bellowing Dragon Crest ring improves the damage of a certain category of magic, or the Ring of the Sun's Firstborn increases damage for another type of magic. If you're using that type of magic, you want to be using that ring to maximize your damage, right? The problem then is when the game is balanced such that in order to get damage out of magic, you have to use the rings. And maybe not even then do you get damage. This is particularly notably a problem in Dark Souls 2, which doesn't really have these rings, so it's not as much of a problem there. But Dark Souls 3 especially has this problem where it feels like all of the magic is kind of, you have to use these rings, but there's two rings that you have to use. So plus the ring to increase cast speed, like you can really have a lot of your ring slots eaten up by trying to make these things viable, which means that you're cutting into like the other generically useful rings, right? Like if you're trying to use magic, you're cutting into your ability to use Chloranthy Ring. And sort of what I'm getting at here, though, is at least those spell rings have like a distinct purpose, and they are actually having like an effective competition. But there's a bunch of rings where it's like you're generally not wanting to use them because the generically good rings push them out. This is a problem, though, that I think is even more pronounced in Pokemon with the hold item. So there's a number of really good hold items. I mentioned Life Orb, which increases the damage but causes you to lose HP whenever you attack. Leftovers I mentioned, which restores a little bit of HP at the end of each turn. These are both really generically good. There's some there's some actually really good ones, the choice items. These improve either your speed or one of your 2 attack stats. But at the cost of, while that Pokemon's out, you can only use the first move that you choose to use. So you have to switch them out and then bring them back, which is a risky business to do because your opponent basically gets free turns on you when you switch, unless you're switching into something where you predict what they're doing. So these items are really interesting because they're really powerful, but they have an equally powerful downside. Doing way more damage or being way faster is really, really strong, but only being able to use one move is really bad. So these items get used with very, very specific builds. They're not generically good. They're situationally good. And that's what I think is interesting, is when what you're trying to do makes it situationally good. And the reason why I say that this becomes a problem is it takes something that can be interesting, can have an interesting decision, and makes it to where it's really not worth trying to make some sort of decision. It makes it no longer a meaningful decision point when coming up with what to do. So in the case of Pokemon, and competitively, it's really easy to say, these are my attacking Pokemon, they all get a Life Orb. These are my Pokemon that are less attack-focused, they all get Leftovers. There's other options in the game. There's some really cool ones. There's things like Balloon, which... or an air balloon, I forget the exact name, but it makes your Pokemon immune to ground type attacks, which can be really good for certain Pokemon. It pops if it's hit, but it gives you a really strong advantage. Sometimes that's useful, and not that often. That's probably okay, but there's a lot of other sort of like, this seems cool, but it's like super niche, and most of the time something else is better. A good example is Safety Goggles, I think it is. It's an item that protects you against certain weather effects that deal damage to you. Sandstorm, for example. And certain types of moves. But most of the time, like, Leftovers is going to counteract the damage that the damaging weather is going to do. And if that weather is not around, then it's probably just better to have Leftovers. Unless you particularly know that somebody's using that type of the type of move that protects you against, which is not that common. So you kind of run into these issues where you have interesting hold items, but most of the time choosing something like Leftovers or Life Orb is correct. And at least it's not wrong. And sometimes your choice can just be wrong. Now, this is just kind of like part of what's going on with the design, and I would really like to see where these items can be somehow more situational. Now, or more accurately, that the items that they have in the game are more situationally good, where you have stuff where it's not just, oh, well, this is always kind of good, so I can, like, it's always good, so I can go with it. And sometimes there's something else that's better, but most of the time there isn't anything like just straight better. And like I said, I feel like this is kind of a particular problem in the Dark Souls games, where you have things like Havel's Ring, Ring of Favor and Protection, Chloranthy Ring, that are all just so generically good that most of the time you're not bothering to look at what other rings you have. And this is like especially the case in Dark Souls 1, where you only have 2 ring slots. So I do appreciate that they gave you more, but on the other hand, the rings are kind of weaker in the future games. So anyway, like this is something that I find, and again, you have to be like really intentional from the ground up. Do you make a stamina regeneration ring, or if you do you put some sort of trade-off on it? You say, okay, well, it boosts your stamina, but like maybe it boosts your stamina based upon how much equip weight you have, right? So if you don't have very much equip weight on and equip percentage, in other words, if you have the really good dodge, it doesn't help your stamina regenerate very much, but if you have like bad dodges, it really helps your stamina regenerate. Like that would be more interesting, because it's only really good on certain types of builds, and frankly, they're types of builds that aren't very good to begin with. So if you introduced rings that would make those builds good, that would be really exciting. And just stuff like that, I think, could be really interesting. But anyway, that's kind of something that I think about, is how can things that have the potential to be interesting decisions when coming up with builds, how can we make sure as game designers that they are interesting decisions? And part of the way of doing that is to look at what sort of effects are you planning on putting into your game in that sort of like augmenting item category, for example, that aren't just generically good. It can be really easy to come up with like, oh yeah, and this effect would be a nice one to have. But then ask yourself, is it so nice that people aren't going to look at any of your other options? And if that's the case, maybe it's too nice. So that's kind of my thoughts on this. I'd love to hear what you might have to think about this topic, or if there's any other topics that you think would be interesting to talk about in the future. I'd love to hear your suggestions. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.